the Last Supper. When we hear these words, what comes to mind? Many visualize a famous image, a group of men around a table, the serious countenance of Jesus, the postures of his disciples laden with meaning. But behind this scene, which many consider one of the most iconic of Christianity, there is a profound context that transcends the visual, a context of traditions, rituals, and an event where the physical and spiritual dimensions meet. Today, we will go back to the time of Jesus, to ancient Jerusalem, in one of the most symbolic periods for the Jewish people, Passover. This event is the backdrop for the Last Supper and carries with it a complexity that needs to be unraveled. The Jewish Passover, or Pesach, is a celebration of liberation, dating back to the escape from Egypt. The Passover meal is a ritual of collective memory, a symbol of overcoming slavery and the pursuit of spiritual and physical freedom. Jesus and his disciples, as devout Jews, participated in this annual ritual. However, on that specific night, something was to be different. Jesus knew this would be his last meeting with his disciples before facing the ultimate sacrifice. And it is here that we begin to realize that, more than a common meal, this supper carried a special purpose. The symbolism of the elements of the Jewish feast, the unleavened bread, the lamb, the bitter herbs, each had a specific purpose, and Jesus would use these elements to convey a profound message of transformation. At that time, rituals were the most powerful channel for spiritual communication, a way to convey teachings through lived experiences. Jesus knew that his followers would understand his words and actions in a new, deeper way, especially when associated with familiar symbols, such as bread and wine. He was giving a new meaning to Passover, reinterpreting it as a path to spiritual awakening. In Jewish tradition, the unleavened bread, called matzah, represents purity and humility, symbolizing the hasty exit from Egypt and the simplicity of those who leave behind all that is superfluous. The wine, on the other hand, was a symbol of joy and celebration, but also of covenant, present in various passages of the Bible as a pact of communion. Thus, by bringing these elements together at his Last Supper, Jesus was preparing his disciples to understand something greater, something that transcended tradition. But what was Jesus really trying to communicate? In many ways, the Last Supper was the preparation for a spiritual initiation. He was leading his followers into a new kind of ritual, a rite of passage. The bread and the wine would become not just symbols of memory, but also living representations of his essence, of his divine presence. He was leaving his disciples a spiritual inheritance that would serve as an eternal reminder of his mission, his message, and most importantly, his promise of renewal. Furthermore, at that time, the concept of master and disciple was understood in a unique way. Masters did not just transmit knowledge, they offered experiences, living guides for transformation. Jesus was seen not only as a master, but also as a mystical figure, an incarnation of the sacred. By conducting this supper, he positioned himself not just as the leader of a group, but as the spiritual guide who provides the path to redemption and self-knowledge. For the disciples, participating in this supper was not just an act of communion, but a moment of preparation for a larger and transcendental event. The Last Supper also marks an important transition in the life of Jesus and his followers. There, at that moment, he begins to introduce the concept of sacrifice, but not just any sacrifice, the supreme sacrifice. A sacrifice that leads to elevation, a mystical mystery where death is the beginning of a new life. It is a transformation that he would experience first, but would leave as an example for those who followed him. He was showing that spiritual life requires courage to face the darkness and the death of the ego, a path that he would tread shortly after this supper. Another crucial point is that, at the moment when he breaks the bread and offers the wine, Jesus creates a symbol of unity. He is not just talking about unity between him and his disciples, but about a universal connection. By sharing these elements, he introduces the idea that everyone is united in a common mission. This is particularly powerful, as at that time communion rituals had profound meanings of solidarity and brotherhood. The disciples understood that this gesture transcended the moment and would become a practice to be replicated, a sacred union that would bind them even after his physical departure. By choosing that moment, Jesus was also planting the seed of a new type of covenant, not based on laws and dogmas, but on love and sacrifice. He is, in a certain sense, founding a new tradition, a ritual that would come to be practiced in his memory, but which would carry the spirit of his message. Every detail of the supper, every gesture, is part of a carefully woven symbolic plan where he connects the visible to the invisible, the physical to the spiritual. Thus, by finishing this meal with his disciples, he was not only celebrating a farewell dinner, but inaugurating a spiritual path, a mystical ritual of passage. The Last Supper becomes a moment of deep spiritual significance, where the earthly plane and the divine plane intersect in a powerful fusion. It is the first step of a journey that would lead to the cross, but at the same time, offer a promise of eternal life, a message of hope and union. Concluding this section, we see that the Last Supper was not a simple gathering, but an event planned to transcend time. A mystical ritual intended to mark souls and perpetuate a message of transformation, love, and sacrifice. The spiritual depth of that moment was so great that in repeating this ritual, Christians to this day connect with this experience of unity and transcendence. In the mystical tradition, a rite of passage marks a point of transformation, an inner journey of evolution where the individual is led from one phase of life to another, higher one. Jesus, in performing the Last Supper, was not only establishing a farewell, but also introducing his disciples to a path of spiritual transformation. He knew that this encounter was the prelude to an intense journey, not only for him, but for each of his followers. In this context, the Last Supper can be understood as an initiation ceremony, where Jesus was preparing his disciples to face a new spiritual reality. During this encounter, Jesus conveyed subtle yet powerful lessons about detachment, sacrifice, and the transcendence of material life. By referring to the bread as his body and the wine as his blood, he used symbolic language to explain that the spiritual experience is, in essence, a process of surrender and rebirth. Thus, he invited his disciples to undergo a symbolic death of the ego, a detachment from earthly identity in favor of a greater communion with the divine. This message was not just a metaphor. For Jesus, it was a mystical truth, a gateway to deeper spirituality. The structure of the Last Supper also evokes aspects of ancient initiation rituals, such as those found in Egyptian and Greek mysteries, where initiates underwent a cycle of death and spiritual rebirth. In such traditions, the master guiding the disciple on this path was essential, as the process itself required courage and faith. Jesus, with his profound spiritual knowledge, offers the disciples a glimpse of the path he was about to tread, a path of sacrifice and redemption. This moment, then, becomes a collective initiation, where each disciple is invited to abandon their old self and embrace the new. In Jewish mysticism and other traditions, the concept of sacrament involves not just a physical act, but a connection with the spiritual world, a gateway to something greater. In sharing the bread and wine, Jesus was introducing this idea to his disciples. The bread, which symbolizes the body, represents the connection with earthly life. The wine, the blood, represents the vital energy, the divine essence that flows through everyone. Thus, by blessing these elements, Jesus transformed the physical into spiritual, creating a symbol of unity and sacredness. He wanted his disciples to understand that earthly life and spiritual life are not separate, but united through these rituals. By participating in this ritual, the disciples were, consciously or not, committing themselves to a new path, a new way of seeing the world. Jesus introduced a way of life where the material and the spiritual intertwine. This new perspective carried a weight of responsibility, as they would be the bearers of Jesus' message and essence after his departure. The act of sharing bread and wine would become an eternal symbol of this responsibility, constantly reminding them of the divine purpose they had accepted at that supper. However, this rite of passage also brought an invitation to unconditional love and humility. Jesus knew that his message could only be truly understood through direct experience, through contact with the divine, through love and compassion. He wanted his disciples, as they shared the bread and the wine, to experience a glimpse of his divine presence. Each piece of bread, each drop of wine, became a connection to his energy, his wisdom, and his essence. Thus, by participating in this supper, they experienced a fusion of their souls with that of Jesus, creating a profound spiritual bond. This rite of passage also required disciples to detach themselves from fear. By symbolizing his body and blood through bread and wine, Jesus confronted the idea of mortality and brought a new vision of death. For him, death was not the end, but a transition stage, a gateway to a greater reality. By inviting his disciples to share in this symbolism, Jesus prepared them to see life as a continuous spiritual journey where the fear of death has no place. He encouraged them to embrace eternity, to see beyond the physical body, and to understand the true meaning of the immortal soul. Another powerful aspect of this ritual is the invitation to unity. Jesus was about to face the greatest of trials, and he knew his disciples would need to stand together to carry on the mission. The bread and wine, as shared elements, become symbols of a spiritual communion, a connection that transcends individual differences. This unity was essential for them to understand that they were not alone in their journey, that each was part of a larger whole, a single body driven by a single essence. The Last Supper, therefore, marks a moment when Jesus himself assumes the role of spiritual guide for his disciples, leading them to a heightened state of consciousness. This rite of passage represents the commitment to a new life, a life where Jesus' teaching becomes not just words, but real practices manifested in their daily lives. Every action, every choice from that moment on, should be guided by the message of love, compassion, and unity that he had taught. This was the silent, yet profound pact that each disciple established that night. Finally, this ritual is a constant reminder that spiritual transformation is not easy, but it is necessary. Jesus knew that the path he proposed required surrender and trust. He knew that in following this path, his disciples would face challenges and persecutions. However, by carrying out the Last Supper, he strengthens them spiritually, offering them a glimpse of the power of faith and inner transformation. He guides them towards the courage needed to face the unknown and embrace their true essence. With this, we conclude that the Last Supper was a mystical rite of passage, a ceremony of profound transformation. Jesus knew that after that night, nothing would be the same again. This ritual planted the seeds so that his disciples, as well as all those who would follow his teachings, could experience a life of spiritual union and transcendence. He prepared each one of them to tread the path of enlightenment, a path that begins with surrender and ends with the discovery of a greater reality. The symbolism of bread and wine in the Last Supper transcends any literal understanding. Jesus chooses these elements with a profound purpose, as both contain within themselves spiritual meanings that trace back to ancient traditions and sacred rituals. Bread, in many cultures, represents the staple food, nutrition, something that sustains life. By saying, "This is my body," Jesus not only shares something physical, but infuses that bread with a mystical aspect, making it a representation of his own being. The bread, therefore, comes to symbolize not just material life, but a spiritual life that nourishes the souls of his followers. Wine, on the other hand, is a beverage that requires time and patience to produce. From the harvesting of the grapes to the fermentation process, there is a transformation that symbolizes the journey of the human spirit. By saying, "This is my blood," Jesus embodies this transformation, making wine a metaphor for sacrifice and the life that flows, just as blood flows through the body. Thus, wine is not just a beverage, it represents the essence of life, the divine power that nourishes the spirit and connects it to the sacred. This symbol was deeply understood by his disciples, as wine was already seen as a sacred element in various cultures of the time. Furthermore, bread and wine have a connection with the earth and the cycle of nature. Bread comes from wheat, which is planted, grows, and when harvested and ground, undergoes a transformation until it becomes food. Wine goes through the same transformation process. Jesus, by choosing these elements, was showing that spirituality also follows a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Bread and wine thus become representations of the transformation cycle that each of his followers must experience on their spiritual journey. They are symbols of a journey of self-discovery and inner growth. In Jewish tradition, bread and wine also have specific meanings. The bread, especially the unleavened bread used at Passover, symbolizes purity and absence of ego, a life without pride or vanity. By using bread as a symbol of his body, Jesus indicates that his essence is pure, free from the impurities of ego. Meanwhile, wine was traditionally used in celebrations and covenants, representing joy and fellowship. By offering the wine as his blood, Jesus transforms this idea of fellowship into a spiritual covenant, a sacred pact between him and his disciples. He invites each one to participate in this covenant, committing to a path of faith and unconditional love. The act of breaking bread and sharing wine also carries a symbolism of unity. When the bread is broken, it teaches that, even when physically separated, everyone is united in the same essence. By offering the wine, Jesus establishes that this unity is sustained by love and compassion. Each disciple, in consuming the bread and wine, was receiving a part of Jesus' spiritual presence, becoming one with him and with everyone else. This gesture not only strengthens the connection between them, but becomes a reminder that in essence, everyone is part of something bigger and sacred. These elements, the bread and the wine, also evoke the idea of sacrifice. By offering the bread as his body and the wine as his blood, Jesus anticipates the sacrifice he is about to make, offering himself for the redemption of his followers. The bread, when broken, represents the fragmentation of the physical body, the suffering he is willing to face. The wine, poured out, symbolizes the blood he is about to offer. For Jesus, this sacrifice is not an end, but a means of uniting his disciples to a higher dimension. He invites each one to participate in this sacrifice, not in the sense of suffering, but of detachment from the ego and surrender to divine love. In the Christian tradition, bread and wine have become part of the communion ritual, in which practitioners relive the sacrifice and love of Jesus. Each time the bread and wine are shared, it's as if the moment of the Last Supper is reenacted, bringing the spiritual presence of Jesus into the present. This ritual is not just a remembrance, but a form of direct experience, a means of connecting with the energy of Jesus and recommitting to his teachings. Thus, the bread and wine become a channel for healing and spiritual upliftment, strengthening those who partake in this sacred act. There is also an alchemical symbolism in bread and wine. Alchemy, which seeks to transform the material into the spiritual, finds a parallel in the transformation of these elements. The bread and wine represent matter, which through the ritual becomes spiritualized. Jesus, by using these symbols, is teaching that the divine can be present in matter, that the physical body can be a sacred temple. Thus, The ritual of the Last Supper is, in itself, an alchemical act, where the physical and the spiritual become one. He teaches that spiritual life is not an escape from the material world, but a transformation where both meet. This teaching also suggests that every action, no matter how simple, can become sacred. By elevating bread and wine to a spiritual level, Jesus teaches us that by putting intention and love, any gesture can turn into an act of communion with the divine. He shows us that spirituality is in the details of everyday life, in every shared meal, in every moment of unity. This teaching is a reminder that to find the divine, there is no need to search far. The sacred is present in everything, and bread and wine symbolize this truth. In conclusion, the symbolism of bread and wine in the Last Supper is not limited to the material aspect. They become symbols of a universal truth, a message of love, sacrifice, and spiritual union. Jesus, by using these elements, creates a ritual that transcends time, which is still today a gateway for those seeking to understand the true meaning of his message. The bread and wine are a reminder that, through union with the divine, we can achieve a full and spiritualized life. They invite us to live a life where the sacred is found in the simple, in the everyday, in the act of sharing and connecting with others. When we talk about sacrifice, it's easy to associate this word with pain, loss, and renunciation. But, in the context of the Last Supper, Jesus transforms the concept of sacrifice into something much deeper, elevating it to an act of redemption and transcendence. He knew that his impending sacrifice was not confined to the physical plane. It was an act with vast spiritual implications, a turning point for both him and his disciples. By sharing the bread and wine, Jesus prepares his followers to understand that sacrifice is, in fact, a journey of transformation, where the surrender of oneself paves the way for the renewal of the soul. This sacrifice that Jesus was about to make was a reflection of the essence of his message: unconditional love and complete surrender. He saw the act of giving his life not as a defeat, but as a spiritual victory, a way to show that true power is not in preserving physical life at any cost, but in being willing to let go of it for a greater purpose. By surrendering, Jesus embodies the truth that sacrifice is a bridge to redemption, an act that purifies and elevates both the one who performs it and those who benefit from it. In the spiritual tradition, the concept of redemption is a purification, a way of returning to the divine essence. For Jesus, the sacrifice he was about to make represented exactly that, a means of purifying humanity, of opening a door so that everyone could achieve a direct connection with the divine. This sacrifice, then, was not just for him, but for all those who followed him and those who would come to follow him. Jesus knew that his act of surrender would plant seeds of faith and hope that would germinate over the centuries, offering spiritual seekers a path of transformation. Sacrifice also has an aspect of humility. Jesus, as a leader and teacher, was willing to put himself in the most vulnerable position, to face death as a mere mortal. This humility reveals a profound spiritual truth. The more we detach from our ego, the closer we are to the divine. By accepting his sacrifice, he teaches us that true redemption comes when we let go of the desire for control, for power, and open ourselves to the flow of life, trusting that the universe or the divine takes care of all the details. He knew that by embracing this vulnerability, his disciples would understand the strength of humility. During the Last Supper, as he shared the bread and wine, Jesus was planting in his disciples the idea that, like him, they too would be called to make sacrifices. He was preparing each of them to face the adversities that would come, not with fear, but with the confidence that sacrifice is a natural stage of the spiritual path. He wanted them to see sacrifice as a form of renewal, where, by letting go of ego, ambition, and fear, they would find a more fulfilling life, full of purpose and love. The idea that redemption comes through sacrifice would be a truth they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But sacrifice also has a role in liberation. By offering his body and blood, Jesus freed his disciples from the burden of guilt, from the limitations imposed by society, and even from their own fears. He showed that sacrifice, when made consciously and lovingly, is capable of dissolving the chains that bind us to the past, paving the way for a future of freedom and inner peace. By sacrificing himself, Jesus gave them the key to break free from cycles of suffering and live a life connected with the divine. Jesus also used sacrifice as a means of transcendence. He knew that by giving up his life, he would transcend physical existence and become an eternal spiritual presence, a source of inspiration and guidance for all those seeking the truth. This act of transcendence is one of the greatest symbols of his message. He showed that life is not limited to the physical body, that the soul is eternal, and that by transcending earthly boundaries, we can achieve a state of union with the divine. This sacrifice was not, then, a loss, but a passage to something greater, a call for all his disciples to follow the same path. Furthermore, the Last Supper and the sacrifice of Jesus reveal the transformative power of love. By accepting his fate, Jesus shows that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of healing, uniting, and transforming. He knew that by sacrificing himself for love, he would be leaving an eternal legacy, a living example that true love does not seek rewards, but gives itself completely, without reservations. This unconditional surrender would be the basis of his teaching, a truth he wanted his disciples to take to the world, helping them live a life of compassion and connection with all. The sacrifice of Jesus, then, is more than an act of redemption. It is a call for transformation. He wanted his disciples and all who would come after to understand that true redemption lies in transformation, in elevating oneself to a state where ego, fear, and attachment no longer rule life. By sacrificing himself, Jesus was showing the path of renewal, a path where death is just a stage, and where the soul is constantly renewed by love and faith. He invited them not to fear sacrifice, but to see it as an opportunity for growth. Finally, Jesus' sacrifice at the Last Supper becomes a symbol of hope. He knew that even after his physical departure, his spiritual presence would continue to guide, heal, and inspire all those who sought his message. The bread and wine would then be a representation of this eternal presence, a reminder that he would always be with them, not as a distant master, but as a living force within each one. He transforms his sacrifice into a promise of eternal life, an affirmation that death is not the end, but just the beginning of a new journey. With this, we see that the power of sacrifice and redemption, as exemplified by Jesus at the Last Supper, is not just a lesson about detachment or suffering, but a profound lesson of spiritual transformation. He teaches us that sacrifice, when done with love and intention, becomes a means of purification and connection with the divine. Jesus invites us to see sacrifice as a path to inner freedom, where every renunciation transforms into an open door for a life of peace, love, and spiritual fulfillment. When analyzing the Last Supper as a rite of transformation, we find fascinating parallels with ancient rituals from various spiritual traditions. In cultures around the world, from ancient Egypt to Greek traditions, rites of transformation have always been celebrated as essential milestones in the journey of spiritual growth. These rites of passage served to guide initiates through processes of purification, symbolic death, and rebirth, preparing them for a life in deeper connection with the divine. Jesus, in performing the Last Supper, followed a sacred tradition of transformation rites that spans centuries and connects man to the mystery of existence. In ancient Egypt, the mysteries of Osiris were a clear example of this process. Initiates underwent symbolic rituals of death and rebirth, in which they experienced the transcendence of material aspects and the encounter with their spiritual essence. This rite of passage evoked the death and resurrection of Osiris, a figure who, like Jesus, was seen as the bearer of a message of eternal life and transformation. Looking at the Last Supper, we notice that Jesus incorporated a similar element by symbolically sacrificing his body and blood, preparing his disciples to understand the concept of life beyond death and the journey of spiritual rebirth. Another example is found in the Orphic mysteries of ancient Greece, associated with the god Dionysius. In the Orphic rites, the initiate was invited to abandon their earthly identity and undergo a symbolic death to be spiritually reborn. Much like the case of Osiris, Dionysius was dismembered and resurrected, representing the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. Jesus, by offering bread and wine as his body and blood, also represented this idea of transformation, showing that true life is not limited to the physical body, but is a continuous expression of the spirit. This parallel suggests that Jesus incorporated these ancient principles, using bread and wine as instruments to guide his disciples through a similar process of renewal. The ancient mysteries of Eleusis in Greece also explored the idea of spiritual transformation. In the rites of Eleusis, participants were led through a symbolic journey of descent into the underworld and return, representing death and resurrection. They learned that true life resides beyond the physical body, and that death is not the end, but a passage to a higher existence. At the Last Supper, Jesus uses this same structure, leading his disciples to an understanding that the physical death he would face was just a stage of his mission. He was showing that the Spirit continues, and that by following him, they too would go through this process of rebirth. These ancient rituals were, in fact, processes of awakening consciousness. Initiates into the ancient mysteries were trained to transcend the ego and access the divine essence within themselves. Jesus, by conducting the Last Supper, was putting his disciples on this same path, a path of inner transformation. He was preparing each of them for a new spiritual life, where the consciousness of unity, love, and compassion would become the center of their lives. The Last Supper, then, can be seen as an adaptation of these ancient rites, where the Master guides his disciples along the path of self-transformation and spiritual awakening. In Hinduism, initiation practices also involve a symbolic death and the abandonment of the old self. The idea of being spiritually reborn, of transcending the limitations of the mind and body, is essential for spiritual growth. Jesus, by symbolizing his own death and resurrection, aligned himself with this understanding that sacrifice is a means of achieving spiritual freedom. By offering bread and wine, he was not just sharing a meal, he was offering a path of transcendence, a call for each of his disciples to also face and be reborn from their own internal challenges. This idea of spiritual transformation is also present in shamanism, where the initiate undergoes a process of symbolic death to be reborn as a healer. In shamanism, the apprentice is led to confront their deepest fears, facing the ego and the illusions of material life to achieve a state of expanded consciousness. Jesus, as a spiritual leader and master, used the Last Supper to offer his disciples a glimpse of this journey. He invited them to overcome the fear of death, to confront their internal limitations, and to embrace a life of service, love, and enlightenment. In the context of these ancient traditions, we see that the Last Supper is more than just a simple event. It is an invitation to profound transformation. Jesus not only followed the practices of his culture, but elevated them to a spiritual level, incorporating elements from various mystical traditions. By bringing the bread and wine, he connected his disciples to a legacy of ancient wisdom, where the ritual of transformation was the path to enlightenment. He knew that by going through this experience, each of his disciples would open up to a greater truth and understand that true spirituality requires transformation and sacrifice. These transformation rituals, whether in the mysteries of Osiris, Dionysus, or in the rites of Eleusis, are representations of the cycle of death and rebirth. By conducting the Last Supper, Jesus was teaching that the spiritual path is also cyclical, that there are moments of renunciation and moments of renewal. He offered the bread and wine as symbols of a journey that they would continue even after his departure. The Last Supper, then, is a synthesis of these rituals, an invitation for his disciples and all who follow his teachings to enter the cycle of rebirth, where each symbolic death is a preparation for a new life. In the end, we realize that the Last Supper holds a wealth of spiritual meanings that resonate with ancient traditions of transformation. Jesus carried this universal wisdom with him, and his farewell ritual becomes a symbol of a new spiritual covenant. He teaches that, by participating in a rite of transformation, the individual connects with the divine, transcends the ego, and is reborn into a life of purpose and connection. Thus, by following this path, the disciples not only became followers of Jesus, but participants in a mystical legacy that spans generations. In conclusion, the Last Supper is the culmination of teachings from various spiritual traditions, where the ritual of transformation is the path to enlightenment. Jesus invites us to see spirituality as a journey of self-transformation, where true awakening is achieved through the union of the physical and the spiritual, the visible and the invisible. Each of us, by following this path, finds in sacrifice and transformation a way to reach the divine essence, a journey of rebirth and discovery of our true self. In the narrative of the Last Supper, few characters are as intriguing and controversial as Judas Iscariot. The figure of Judas and his betrayal have been debated and reinterpreted over the centuries, as his role seems pivotal to the unfolding of events that led to the sacrifice of Jesus. He is not just a traitor, but, in many aspects, represents a mystical concept of duality, of opposing forces intertwining in the pursuit of spiritual purpose. Judas' presence at the Last Supper compels us to reflect on the role of shadow and light, of good and evil, and how these elements coexist in the journey of the soul. For Jesus, Judas's betrayal was not a surprise. He knew that this was part of his destiny, something that would inevitably need to occur for his mission to be completed. Judas, then, assumes a role that transcends the personal and becomes symbolic. He represents the divine opponent, a figure who, by challenging or betraying, propels the protagonist to a higher state of achievement. In mystical traditions, the presence of an opponent or a counterforce is considered essential for spiritual growth, as it is through confrontation with these challenges that the seeker purifies and strengthens. Jesus, by allowing Judas to follow his path, was accepting this role as part of his own transformation process. Judas also symbolizes the internal duality that exists within all of us. Just like him, we all carry within us forces of light and shadow, and it is through the integration of these parts that we become complete beings. Judas, in betraying Jesus, represents the aspect of our own nature that sometimes strays from the divine purpose, seeking self-interest and being led by ego. However, when confronting this duality, we are invited to understand that the spiritual path requires an integration of these opposites. Jesus, by accepting Judas and his betrayal, teaches the lesson of forgiveness and compassion, showing that divine love is capable of transcending even the darkest darkness. The role of Judas also teaches us about the inevitability of sacrifice. In many spiritual traditions, sacrifice is a necessary process for transformation, and Judas, by betraying Jesus, catalyzes this process. He acts as the instrument through which Jesus' mission is fulfilled. Without Judas's betrayal, Jesus' sacrifice might not have occurred in the same way. This leads us to reflect that, on the spiritual journey, there are times when seemingly opposing or destructive forces are necessary to guide us to a greater purpose. What, at first glance, appears to be a negative act, may have a hidden meaning and contribute to the unfolding of a divine mission. This duality is also present in the very concept of light and darkness. Jesus, as the light of the world, is confronted by the shadow of Judas. This shadow is not necessarily evil. It is an essential part of the growth process. The existence of Judas at the Last Supper symbolizes that, for light to expand, it is necessary to face darkness, accept its existence, and learn from it. Jesus, looking at Judas and foreseeing his betrayal, does not condemn him, but accepts him as part of the journey. He knows that the process of redemption requires a confrontation with the shadow, that true love is capable of understanding and embracing duality. Another interesting aspect is the concept of free will and destiny. Did Judas act on his own, or was he merely an instrument of a divine plan? This question resonates in spirituality and invites us to reflect on the role of free will in our own lives. Jesus knew that the betrayal would occur, but this did not absolve Judas of his responsibility. He chose to betray, and in doing so, he also chose a crucial role in spiritual history. The Last Supper, then, represents not only Jesus' surrender, but Judas's choice. He chose to follow the path of shadow, but paradoxically, this choice propelled Jesus' mission, revealing that even in darkness, there is a connection to the divine purpose. The figure of Judas reminds us that often it is through challenges that the spiritual path manifests itself. Just as Jesus confronted his own shadow through betrayal, we too are called to confront our own limitations, our fears and insecurities. Judas becomes a mirror that reflects the parts of us that we might prefer to hide. He represents the human side that is susceptible to error, to selfishness, and to temptation. Jesus, by accepting Judas at his Last Supper, teaches us that the spiritual path is not just about achieving perfection, but about accepting our own imperfection, integrating it with compassion and understanding. In the mystical context, the duality between Judas and Jesus reminds us of the constant dance between opposites, the eternal game between light and darkness. The presence of Judas at the Last Supper completes the picture, demonstrating that the spiritual process is not linear, but cyclical, involving progress and setbacks. Jesus, in living through this moment of betrayal, teaches us about the importance of accepting life's flow, understanding that obstacles are part of the journey, and that even those who seem to harm us play a role in our spiritual evolution. The Last Supper, then, would not be complete without Judas, for he represents the side of duality that we all must embrace and understand. Finally, Judas also invites us to reflect on forgiveness. Jesus knew what was about to happen, and even so, he shared bread and wine with Judas, showing that his love and compassion were not limited by anyone's actions. He forgives Judas even before the betrayal takes place, demonstrating that true love is unconditional. With this gesture, Jesus teaches the importance of forgiveness and understanding, of seeing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their actions. This unconditional love is a call for us to transcend judgment and embrace compassion in all situations. Thus, at the Last Supper, Judas becomes a complex symbol of duality, challenges, and learning. He reminds us that, to follow the spiritual path, we must face the shadow, learn from our mistakes, and view the entirety of our existence with acceptance. Jesus, by allowing Judas to fulfill his role, teaches us that true enlightenment is not about avoiding darkness, but about transforming it with love. And it is in this balance between light and shadow, acceptance and forgiveness, that we find the path to a full spiritual life. The Last Supper is an event that transcends its historical moment, carrying a spiritual legacy that perpetuates through generations. The communion of Jesus with his disciples, marked by bread and wine, established a lasting foundation for spiritual connection rituals in various traditions. This legacy continues to touch lives, connecting spiritual seekers to the mystery of the divine presence. In Christianity especially, the practice of the Eucharist, which symbolically recreates the Last Supper, has become a powerful bridge between the divine and the human, where participants remember Jesus' sacrifice and renew their commitment to his teachings of love and compassion. This ritual, however, goes beyond a simple act of remembrance. It represents a mystical union, a direct connection with the essence of Jesus. By taking the bread and wine, those practicing communion are invited to experience a spiritual fusion with Christ himself. It is a moment of profound surrender, where one seeks to transcend the ego and open oneself to a greater presence. Jesus, in instituting this act, was offering his disciples and future followers a way to touch the sacred in a personal and direct manner, reinforcing that true communion is an intimate and transformative experience. The idea of sharing bread and wine not only unites the individual with Jesus, but also with the community. The Last Supper established a model of unity, a celebration of spiritual brotherhood that connects people around the world. By participating in this act, people become one, integrated into the same mystical body, united by the love and compassion taught by Jesus. This is one of the deepest legacies of the Last Supper, the understanding that, in spirituality, there is no true separation. We are all part of the same divine essence, linked by the same quest and faith. The practice of the Eucharist, established at the Last Supper, also has a power of spiritual healing. In that sacred moment, each participant is invited to surrender their worries, free themselves from emotional burdens, and renew their faith. This ritual has become, over the centuries, a source of spiritual strength for those facing challenges and seeking comfort in the presence of Jesus. By reliving the act of bread and wine, practitioners connect with the strength of Jesus, finding in him an inexhaustible source of peace, courage, and resilience to overcome life's difficulties. The Last Supper also left a legacy of service and humility. Jesus, in sharing the meal with his disciples, made it clear that the greatest among them would be the servant of all. He taught that true greatness does not reside in power or authority, but in the ability to serve and love unconditionally. This teaching became a fundamental pillar for those seeking to live according to his teachings, inspiring generations to follow the path of compassion and humility. The Last Supper, then, was not just a moment of farewell, but a living lesson on how we should relate to each other. Another aspect of the spiritual legacy of the Last Supper is the idea of sanctifying daily life. By elevating bread and wine, common elements of everyday life, Jesus teaches us that the sacred does not need to be separated from the material world. On the contrary, true spirituality is one that permeates every action, every moment, transforming even the simplest of gestures into an expression of love and divine connection. The Last Supper reminds us that the divine is present in every detail of life, and that by living with intention and awareness, we can transform the everyday into a continuous act of worship. This event also reinforces the idea that true spirituality is a path of inner transformation. By sharing bread and wine, Jesus invites us to look within ourselves, to acknowledge our own limitations, and to seek continuous renewal. The Last Supper is a call for all who celebrate it to commit to a life of spiritual evolution, self-knowledge, and improvement. It teaches us that spiritual growth is a constant journey, where every moment, every choice, and every relationship become opportunities to develop virtues and expand consciousness. Furthermore, the Last Supper establishes a legacy of faith and hope. Jesus, even knowing what was to come, chose to demonstrate peace and confidence, showing his disciples that true faith is one that withstands the greatest trials. This example became a foundation for those facing challenges in their journey. The Last Supper reminds us that even in the darkest hours, faith is the guiding light, the support that strengthens, and the promise that beyond difficulties, there is a divine purpose. This legacy of hope has sustained countless souls over the centuries, providing comfort and guidance in times of uncertainty. The act of sharing bread and wine is also a reminder of the commitment to Jesus' teachings. The Last Supper was not just an event, but a spiritual covenant, a call for all who participate in this ritual to live according to the principles of love, compassion, and service to others. It is a renewal of commitment to the spiritual path, an affirmation that each person, by joining this practice, is willing to follow Jesus' example and transform their life based on these values. This legacy continues to live on, inspiring those who seek a more meaningful and divine-connected life. Finally, the Last Supper is a legacy of unity between the human and the divine. By offering his body and blood, Jesus establishes a bridge between earth and heaven, between the physical and the spiritual. He shows that human life is not an isolated experience, but an expression of the divine. The Last Supper then becomes a ritual of communion with God himself, a moment when the participant remembers their true nature and their connection with the Creator. This is the greatest legacy of the Last Supper, the reminder that we all carry the divine spark, and that through practices of faith and love, we can unite with the whole. In summary, the spiritual legacy of the Last Supper is vast and profound, affecting lives at different levels throughout history. It is a call for unity, for spiritual renewal, for service, and for unconditional love. By reviving Jesus' act, millions of people find meaning, hope, and strength to move forward. The Last Supper was not just an isolated event, but the beginning of a spiritual movement that continues to transform the world, reminding us that by living with faith and compassion, we can touch the sacred and come closer to the divine essence. The Last Supper is more than a religious event. It is a profound message about transformation and self-awareness, which resonates to this day. Beyond the ritual, it symbolizes the inner journey we are all called to undertake. By sharing the bread and wine, Jesus invites us to look within, to seek the truth that resides at the core of our being. Each element of this event carries a key to understanding who we truly are and the purpose we came to fulfill. The Last Supper, in its essence, is a call to connect with the divine that lives within each of us. For self-awareness, the Last Supper represents the process of confronting our own limitations, fears, and frailties. Jesus knew what was to come, and yet, he maintained serenity and surrender. He demonstrated, through his example, that true courage lies in accepting the soul's journey, even when it involves pain and sacrifice. This acceptance is the first step towards self-awareness, as it allows us to face our shadows, acknowledging that, to become complete, we need to integrate both light and darkness within us. At the Last Supper, when offering bread as his body, Jesus speaks to us about the importance of taking care of our physical temple, the foundation that supports our earthly journey. He shows that the body is not just a material structure, but a sacred expression of the spirit, something to be respected and honored. Self-awareness also requires this consciousness of the body, for it is through it that we experience the world and relate to others. By recognizing our body as a channel of the divine, we learn to value each present moment and to live with gratitude for the life that has been given to us. By sharing wine as his blood, Jesus symbolizes the spirit that flows in our veins, the life force that connects us to each other and to the divine. Self-awareness, in this sense, involves recognizing that we are more than bodies and minds. We are part of a larger force, an energy that permeates everything. The Last Supper teaches us that, by connecting with this essence, we can find a deeper meaning in our lives and realize that we are not alone. Each of us carries within ourselves a spark of the divine, a direct link to the whole, and it is this awareness that allows us to expand our vision of who we really are. Furthermore, the Last Supper teaches us about the importance of surrender. Jesus knew that his mission was about to be fulfilled, and even in the face of fear and uncertainty, he fully surrendered to the greater purpose. This surrender is one of the keys to self-knowledge, as it allows us to let go of control and trust in the flow of life. On the spiritual path, this trust is crucial, for it is only by abandoning the need for control that we can truly know ourselves. The Last Supper, then, represents a call to trust, a lesson that by surrendering to the unknown, we find peace and inner clarity. Another fundamental aspect of the Last Supper for self-knowledge is the sense of unity. By sharing bread and wine, Jesus created a spiritual union between him and his disciples, showing that the true nature of our existence is connection. This understanding is essential for self-knowledge, as it reminds us that we are not isolated beings. By recognizing the interconnection with everyone and with the divine, we expand our understanding of ourselves, seeing ourselves as part of something larger. This view of unity leads us to compassion, to the understanding that, by caring for others, we are, in fact, caring for ourselves. The Last Supper also teaches us that the path to self-knowledge is not just a solitary journey, but a process that involves relating to others. Jesus, in gathering his disciples, shows that spirituality is enriched in coexistence and the exchange of experiences. He reminds us that wisdom is built not only on introspection, but also in communion with others. It is in the gaze of others, in the sharing of our pains and joys, that we discover aspects of ourselves that we would not see alone. The Last Supper, therefore, is an invitation for us to connect, to cultivate love and mutual understanding as a form of self-knowledge. The Last Supper also suggests that self-knowledge requires humility. Jesus, being the master and leader, did not place himself above others, but positioned himself alongside his disciples, sharing bread and wine as an equal. He teaches us that true self-knowledge comes from humility, from the willingness to acknowledge our imperfections and to constantly learn. By letting go of pride and ego, we allow the true self to flourish, a self that does not need to hide behind masks or illusions. This humility is an essential virtue on the path to self-knowledge, as it leads us to live authentically. Finally, the Last Supper is a reminder that self-knowledge is an ongoing pursuit. Just as the ritual of the Eucharist repeats in many contexts, the journey to know oneself does not end. It is a constant cycle of rebirth and learning. Jesus knew that each person, by following his teachings, would encounter different levels of understanding over time. The supper teaches us that self-knowledge is a daily practice, where every experience, every challenge, and every relationship is an opportunity to delve deeper into our essence and expand our understanding. In conclusion, the Last Supper is an inexhaustible source of wisdom for self-knowledge. Jesus left us a ritual that symbolizes inner transformation, the path to the divine that is within each one of us. Upon reflecting on this event, we realize that Jesus' spiritual legacy is not just a distant story, but a living guide for our own evolution. The supper inspires us to live with more presence, with compassion, and with the courage to confront our shadows, knowing that, in the end, we are all united by the same spirit of love. And now, Mind Unfettered, I want to hear from you. What does the Last Supper represent to you? Share in the comments your perspective on this powerful moment and what you believe to be the true spiritual legacy of this event. And here's an interesting idea. Think of each comment as a collective manifestation where each of your insights and reflections strengthens the spiritual energy of this channel. Let's together create a community of growth and learning. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, there's something very special waiting for you right now. Click on the next video, The Hidden Truth About Mary Magdalene. Was she the closest disciple of Jesus? In it, we continue to explore the deepest layers of Jesus' journey and his disciples, uncovering mystical truths about Mary Magdalene. Was she the closest disciple of Jesus? Come find out.